From the moment I met him, I knew he was the one. We were young, carefree, and utterly in love. It felt like the universe had conspired to bring us together, weaving our fates into a beautiful tapestry of shared dreams and promises. Our wedding day was the culmination of those dreams, a perfect beginning to what I believed would be a perfect life. We moved into a small but cozy apartment, the kind that feels like home as soon as you step through the door. We talked endlessly about our future, about the house we'd buy, the children we'd have, the places we'd travel to. It was blissful, the kind of happiness that makes you feel invincible. But life has a way of humbling you, of reminding you that nothing is ever as simple as it seems. Our first year of marriage was like living in a bubble, shielded from the harsh realities of the world. But that bubble burst when my husband lost his job. It happened suddenly, like a storm that catches you off guard. One day, he was coming home with stories of office antics and plans for our next vacation, and the next, he was walking through the door with a look of utter defeat on his face. I knew something was wrong the moment I saw him. "We need to talk," he said, his voice heavy. With dread, my heart sank. In that instant, I knew our lives were about to change. He had been let go, downsizing, they called it. The company was restructuring, and he was one of the many casualties. He tried to put on a brave face, but I could see the pain in his eyes, the fear of what this meant for us. I reassured him, told him we'd get through it together, that we'd find a way to make it work. And for a while, I believed it. But as the weeks turned into months, and the job rejections piled up, I could see him slipping away from me. He stopped smiling, stopped talking about the future. Our conversations became strained, filled with awkward silences and unspoken worries. He withdrew into himself, spending hours in front of the computer searching for jobs that never materialized. I tried to be patient, to be supportive. But the pressure of keeping our lives together began to weigh on me. I was working long hours, trying to make ends meet while he sank deeper into depression. The man I married, the man I loved, was disappearing before my eyes, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. It was around this time that his brother entered the picture. His name was Daniel, and he was everything my husband wasn't, or at least, that's how it felt at the time. Where my husband had grown distant and despondent, Daniel was full of life, brimming with energy and confidence. He had always been the more successful of the two, and it was a fact that my husband was painfully aware of, especially now. I remember the day Daniel arrived. It was a cold, rainy afternoon, and the gloom seemed to mirror the mood in our tiny apartment. I was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when I heard the knock on the door. My husband didn't move to answer it, so I wiped my hands on a towel and went to see who it was. When I opened the door, there stood Daniel, a sheepish grin on his face and a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, his clothes wrinkled and his usually neat hair in disarray. "Hey, sis," he said, his voice betraying a hint of uncertainty. "Mind if I crash here for a while?" It was the first time I had seen Daniel look anything less than perfect. I hesitated for a moment, caught off guard by his unexpected appearance, but then I smiled and stepped aside to let him in. "Of course, Daniel," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "You're always welcome here." As he stepped inside, I noticed the tension in my husband's posture. He hadn't moved from his spot on the couch, but his eyes were fixed on Daniel, a mixture of surprise and something else, something darker, flickering in his gaze. "Daniel," he said, his voice flat. "What brings you here?" Daniel shrugged, dropping his bag by the door. "Just needed a place to stay for a bit. Things have been complicated." There was an awkward silence as the brothers sized each other up, the air thick with unspoken words. I could sense the underlying tension between them, a tension that had always been there but had never quite surfaced until now. "Complicated how?" my husband finally asked, his tone betraying a hint of suspicion. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Work stuff. I'd rather not get into it right now, if that's okay." My husband nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Sure, whatever you need." And that was that. Daniel moved into the guest room, the room that we had once planned to turn into a nursery, and just like that, our lives changed. At first, it was a relief to have someone else in the house, someone to break the oppressive silence that had settled between my husband and me. Daniel was charming, funny, and effortlessly easy to talk to. He had a way of making you feel like the most important person in the room, and I found myself looking forward to our conversations, to the moments when he would flash me one of his signature grins and say something that would make me laugh. But as the days turned into weeks, I started to notice the subtle shifts in our dynamic. Daniel was always around, always there to lend a hand or offer a listening ear. He was attentive in a way that my husband no longer was, and I found myself drawn to him in ways I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just his charm or his good looks, though those certainly didn't hurt. It was the way he made me feel seen, the way he seemed to understand the weight I was carrying. He would listen as I vented about my day, offering words of comfort and encouragement that my husband no longer seemed capable of giving. One night, after a particularly long day at work, I came home to find Daniel in the kitchen, cooking dinner. The smell of garlic and onions filled the air, and for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. This was something my husband used to do, surprise me with dinner, make me feel cared for. But now, it was Daniel standing at the stove, his sleeves rolled up and a smile on his face. "Hey, you," he said, glancing over his shoulder as I walked in. "Rough day," I nodded, too tired to speak. Daniel handed me a glass of wine, his fingers brushing against mine as he did. The touch was brief, almost accidental, but it sent a shiver down my spine. "Sit down," he said, his voice gentle. "Dinner's almost ready," I obeyed, sinking into one of the kitchen chairs as I watched him move around the kitchen with ease. It was a scene that felt almost too domestic, too comfortable. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to stop it. As we ate, Daniel told me about his day, about the latest drama at his job and the antics of his co-workers. I laughed more than I had in weeks, the tension in my shoulders slowly easing with each sip of wine. For a little while, I forgot about the stress, the worries, the suffocating weight of my life. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw my husband standing in the doorway, watching us. His face was a mask of unreadable emotions, but there was something in his eyes, something that made my heart clench with guilt. Daniel must have noticed too, because he quickly changed the subject, his tone a little too bright, a little too forced. My husband didn't say anything, just nodded and walked away, leaving me with a hollow feeling in the pit of my stomach. I tried to brush it off, to convince myself that there was nothing wrong, that I was just imagining things. But deep down, I knew that something had shifted, something that couldn't be easily undone. The weeks passed in a blur of routine and small, stolen moments. My husband continued his search for a job, growing more withdrawn with each passing day. I did my best to keep everything together, to maintain the semblance of a normal life, but it was becoming harder and harder to ignore the tension that simmered beneath the surface. And then, one evening, everything changed. It was a Friday night, and my husband had gone to bed early, exhausted from yet another day of fruitless job hunting. Daniel and I were alone in the living room, the only light coming from the flickering flames of the fireplace. We had been talking, as we often did, about nothing in particular, just the kind of casual, easy conversation that had become our routine. But there was something different about that night. Maybe it was the wine we had been drinking, or the way the firelight cast shadows on Daniel's face, making him look both familiar and utterly foreign. Or maybe it was just the culmination of all those weeks of tension, of unspoken words and lingering looks. I don't remember who moved first, or how it happened. One moment, we were sitting on opposite ends of the couch, and the next, we were kissing, our bodies pressed together in a way that felt both thrilling and terrifying. For a split second, I wanted to pull away, to stop before we crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But then Daniel's hands were on me, and the need that had been building inside me for so long finally found its release. It wasn't just about the physical attraction, though that was certainly part of it. It was about the connection, the sense of being seen and understood in a way that I hadn't felt in a long time. With Daniel, I didn't have to pretend that everything was okay, that I was okay. I could just be, without the weight of my responsibilities pressing down on me. As we lay together afterward, the reality of what we had done began to sink in. I stared up at the ceiling, my mind racing with guilt and confusion. This was wrong, so horribly, irrevocably wrong. But it had also felt so right, in a way that I couldn't explain. Daniel must have sensed my turmoil because he reached out, his fingers gently brushing against my cheek. "It's going to be okay," he whispered, his voice laced with a certainty that I didn't feel. "We'll figure this out." But I didn't know how we could possibly figure this out. We had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and now, there was no going back. In the days that followed, I tried to act normal, to pretend that nothing had changed. But every time I looked at my husband, the guilt gnawed at me, eating away at the fragile facade I had built. I found myself avoiding him, making excuses to stay late at work or to run errands that I didn't really need to do. Anything to avoid the inevitable confrontation that I knew was coming, but the more I tried to distance myself from my husband, the closer I seemed to get to Daniel. We would steal moments together when we could, quick kisses in the hallway, lingering touches when my husband wasn't looking. It was reckless and dangerous, but I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop. And then, one night, everything came crashing down. My story isn't over yet. Please consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you. Back to the story. My husband had gone out for the evening to meet with some old friends, leaving Daniel and me alone in the house. We tried to keep our distance, to avoid temptation, but it was a losing battle. The attraction between us was too strong, the pull too irresistible. We were in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner, when Daniel suddenly grabbed my hand, pulling me toward him. "I can't keep doing this," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I can't keep pretending that this doesn't mean anything." His words sent a shock through me, both thrilling and terrifying. For a moment, I just stood there, my heart racing, as I looked up at him. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the desperation, and the longing that mirrored my own. "What do you mean?" I whispered, though I already knew the answer. Daniel took a deep breath, his grip on my hand tightening. "This us. It's not just some fling. It's real, and it's tearing me apart. I hate sneaking around, lying to my brother, pretending that what we have isn't important." I felt my throat tighten, a mix of emotions swirling inside me. "Daniel, we can't. We shouldn't." "But we are," he interrupted, his voice raw with emotion. "We're here, and it's happening. And I don't know how to stop it, or if I even want to." His words echoed the thoughts that had been running through my mind for weeks. I didn't know how to stop either, even though every rational part of me screamed that I should. But the more we tried to pull away, the stronger the pull seemed to become, like gravity drawing us together no matter how hard we fought against it. Before I could respond, Daniel's lips were on mine again, more insistent this time. There was a desperation to the kiss, a sense that this might be our last chance to hold on to whatever it was we had found in each other. And in that moment, all the doubts and fears melted away, leaving only the need to be with him, to feel that connection that had become my lifeline. But just as quickly as the moment had ignited, it was shattered by the sound of the front door opening. My heart stopped, and I pushed Daniel away, my mind racing as the reality of the situation crashed down around us. My husband was home, and we were caught. Panic gripped me as I hurriedly adjusted my clothes, trying to look as normal as possible. Daniel did the same, his expression a mask of calm, but I could see the fear in his eyes, mirroring my own. "Hey," my husband called from the front door, his voice carrying through the house. "I'm back." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to respond. "We're in the kitchen." A moment later, my husband appeared in the doorway, a tired smile on his face. He looked at the two of us, then at the mess in the kitchen, his smile fading slightly as he took in the scene. "Everything okay?" he asked, his tone casual, but I could hear the underlying suspicion. "Yeah," I said quickly, too quickly. "We were just cleaning up." My husband's eyes flicked between Daniel and me, and I could see the gears turning in his mind. He wasn't stupid. He knew something was off, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. "Not yet." "Okay," he said slowly, his gaze lingering on Daniel for a moment longer than necessary. "Well, I'm going to head to bed. It's been a long day." I nodded, my heart pounding as I watched him turn and walk away, up the stairs to our bedroom. It wasn't until I heard the door close behind him that I let out the breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Daniel stepped closer to me, his hand brushing against mine. "That was too close," he whispered, his voice laced with fear and adrenaline. I nodded, still shaken. "We can't do this anymore, Daniel. We're going to get caught, and then I don't know what will happen." He looked at me, his eyes searching mine. "Maybe we need to tell him. Maybe it's time we stop hiding and face the consequences." His words sent a chill down my spine. The idea of coming clean, of laying everything out in the open, was terrifying. It meant destroying everything we had built, hurting someone I had once loved deeply, and facing the reality of what we had done. But before I could respond, a sound from upstairs caught our attention. It was the sound of something crashing, followed by the unmistakable sound of my husband's voice, raised in anger. My heart leapt into my throat as I realized what was happening. He had found something, maybe our messages, maybe a clue we had overlooked. Whatever it was, the truth was out. Without a word, Daniel and I rushed upstairs, my mind racing with a mix of fear and dread. When we reached the bedroom, I found my husband standing in the middle of the room, holding my phone in his hand. His face was pale, his eyes filled with a mixture of rage and betrayal. "I knew it," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I knew something was going on, but I didn't want to believe it. How long has this been going on?" The room was spinning, and I felt like I was on the verge of collapsing. This was it, the moment of reckoning. There was no more hiding, no more lying. The truth was out, and there was no going back. "I'm sorry," I whispered, the words feeling hollow even as I said them. "I never meant for this to happen, never meant for it to happen," he repeated, his voice rising. "You've been lying to me, both of you, for who knows how long, and you didn't mean for it to happen." Daniel stepped forward, his expression serious. "This isn't just her fault. I'm just as responsible for what happened. I'm sorry, brother, truly I am." But my husband's eyes were fixed on me, the hurt and anger radiating from him like a physical force. "How could you do this to me? To us?" I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. How could I explain something that I barely understood myself? How could I justify the pain I had caused? But before I could even begin to try, my husband shook his head, his expression hardening. "I can't do this right now. I need you both to leave. Just leave." The finality of his words hit me like a blow, and for a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. But then Daniel's hand was on my arm, guiding me out of the room, out of the house, out of the life that I had just destroyed. As we walked out into the cold night air, I felt like I was in a daze, numb to everything except the overwhelming sense of loss. The life I had known, the future I had once envisioned, was gone. All that was left was the wreckage of our actions, and the uncertain path that lay ahead. In the days following our departure, everything seemed to blur together. I moved in with Daniel, though it felt more like I was moving through life in a haze. We rented a small apartment on the other side of town, far enough away from the home I had shared with my husband that I wouldn't be constantly reminded of what I had lost. But no matter how far I tried to distance myself from my old life, the guilt was always there, lurking just beneath the surface, ready to strike when I least expected it. I couldn't escape the memories, the look of betrayal in my husband's eyes as he stood there holding my phone, the realization that I had shattered something that could never be repaired. Daniel tried to be supportive, but I could see the strain in his eyes too. We were both grappling with the consequences of our actions, trying to navigate a relationship that had been built on lies and deceit. The initial thrill of the affair had long since faded, replaced by a heavy weight of reality that neither of us could ignore. It wasn't long before the cracks in our new life began to show. One night, as we sat in the dimly lit living room of our apartment, Daniel turned to me, his expression serious. "We need to talk about what happens next." I looked at him, my heart sinking. "What do you mean?" "I mean, where do we go from here?" he asked, his voice laced with uncertainty. "We can't keep pretending that everything's fine, that we're not both struggling with what we did." I knew he was right, but I didn't want to face it. I had spent so long trying to hold on to something, anything, that would make this new reality bearable. But the truth was, nothing could make it okay. We had crossed a line, and now we were paying the price. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to fix this," Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Maybe we can't fix it. Maybe the best thing we can do is move on, try to start over." The thought of starting over, of leaving everything behind, was both terrifying and strangely appealing. But could we really do that? Could we build a life together on the ruins of what we had destroyed? "I don't want to lose you," I said, my voice trembling. "But I don't know if we can make this work." Daniel looked at me, his expression conflicted. "I don't want to lose you either. But maybe we need some time apart, to figure out what we really want." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. The thought of being apart from Daniel, of facing the world alone, was terrifying. But deep down, I knew he was right. We had rushed into this without thinking, and now we were both drowning in the consequences. "I think you're right," I finally said, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. "Maybe some time apart is what we need." The decision was made, but it didn't make it any easier. The next day, Daniel packed his bags and left, leaving me alone in the apartment that had once felt like a refuge but now felt like a prison. I spent hours pacing the small space, my mind racing with thoughts of what could have been, what should have been. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to think about my husband, really think about him. I wondered how he was doing, whether he was okay, whether he had found some way to move on from the pain I had caused. The guilt gnawed at me, a constant reminder of my betrayal. Days turned into weeks, and I tried to keep myself busy, to distract myself from the overwhelming sense of loss. But nothing seemed to help. The apartment was too quiet, too empty, and every moment alone only amplified the guilt that had taken root in my heart. And then, one day, I received a text message from my husband. It was short, just a few words, but it was enough to send my heart racing. "We need to talk." My hands trembled as I typed out a response, agreeing to meet him at a coffee shop in town. I didn't know what to expect, whether he was going to yell at me, or tell me he never wanted to see me again. But I knew I owed it to him, to both of us, to face whatever was coming. When I arrived at the coffee shop, my husband was already there, sitting at a table near the window. He looked different, thinner, more tired, but there was a calmness about him that I hadn't seen in a long time. I hesitated for a moment before walking over to him, my heart pounding in my chest. He looked up as I approached, his expression unreadable. "Hi," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Hi," he replied, gesturing for me to sit down. I sat across from him, feeling a wave of emotion wash over me. There was so much I wanted to say, but I didn't know where to start. "I'm sorry," I finally blurted out, the words tumbling out of me in a rush. "I'm so sorry for everything. I never meant to hurt you. I never wanted things to end up like this." My husband nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the table. "I know," he said quietly. "I've had a lot of time to think about everything, and I know this wasn't easy for you either." His words surprised me, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. "I'm not here to blame you," he continued, finally looking up at me. "I'm not here to rehash everything that happened. I just needed to see you, to talk to you." The relief I felt was overwhelming, and I had to blink back tears as I nodded. "I'm glad you reached out." We sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of everything that had happened hanging between us. But there was a sense of closure in that silence, a feeling that we were both finally ready to move forward, even if it meant going our separate ways. "I've decided to move out of the city," my husband said after a while, his voice steady. "I need a fresh start, away from all of this. I think it's the best thing for both of us." The news hit me like a blow, but I knew he was right. We couldn't keep living in the past, couldn't keep holding on to something that was already gone. "I understand," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I want you to be happy, to find peace." He smiled faintly, a sad, bittersweet smile. "I want the same for you." We talked for a while longer, about mundane things, work, plans for the future, but it was clear that we were both saying goodbye, in our own way. When we finally stood to leave, he reached out and gave me a hug, a gesture that was both comforting and heartbreaking. "Take care of yourself," he said softly as he pulled away. "You too," I replied, my voice trembling, and then, with one last lingering look, he walked out of the coffee shop and out of my life. I watched him go, feeling a strange mixture of sadness and relief. This was the end of one chapter, but maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something new. The days following our final conversation were some of the hardest I've ever experienced. My husband had moved away, and Daniel and I were still apart, trying to figure out what the future held for us, if there even was a future. I found myself alone in a way I hadn't been for years, and the weight of my decisions pressed down on me like a suffocating blanket. I threw myself into my work, taking on extra projects and spending long hours at the office. It was easier than being alone with my thoughts, easier than facing the reality of what I had done. But no matter how busy I kept myself, I couldn't escape the guilt, the nagging feeling that I had made a mess of everything. I knew that I needed to talk to Daniel, to figure out where we stood, but I couldn't bring myself to reach out. Every time I picked up the phone, I hesitated, afraid of what I might hear on the other end. What if he had moved on? What if he had decided that we weren't worth the effort? But eventually, the silence became too much to bear. One evening, after another long day at work, I finally gathered the courage to call him. "Hello?" His voice on the other end of the line sent a jolt of nerves through me. "Hi, Daniel. It's me." There was a pause, and I could hear the tension in his voice when he responded. "Hey. How are you?" I've been better, I admitted, my heart pounding. I was wondering if we could talk. Yeah, we should, he agreed, his tone cautious. Are you free tomorrow? We could meet up. Tomorrow works, I said, relieved that he was willing to talk. We made plans to meet at a park near my apartment, and I spent the rest of the night tossing and turning, unable to quiet my racing thoughts. What would we say to each other? Could we find a way to move forward, or was this the end for us too? The next day, I arrived at the park early, my nerves frayed as I waited for Daniel to show up. When I finally saw him walking toward me, my heart skipped a beat. He looked different, more serious, more guarded, but the sight of him still sent a wave of longing through me. Hey, I said as he approached, my voice shaky. Hey, he replied, his expression unreadable. Thanks for meeting me. We sat down on a bench, the tension between us palpable. For a moment, neither of us spoke, and I wondered if this was how it would end, in awkward silence, with too many things left unsaid. But then Daniel turned to me, his eyes searching mine. I've been doing a lot of thinking, he began, his voice steady. About us, about what happened. I held my breath, waiting for the words that would either break my heart or give me hope. I care about you, more than I've cared about anyone in a long time, he continued, his expression softening. But I don't know if what we have is enough to build a life on. We started this the wrong way, and I'm not sure we can fix it. His words hit me like a blow, but I couldn't deny the truth in them. We had built our relationship on a foundation of lies and betrayal, and now we were paying the price. I know, I said quietly, my throat tight. I've been thinking the same thing. I don't want to lose you, but I don't want us to keep hurting each other either. Daniel nodded, his gaze dropping to the ground. Maybe we need more time. Time to figure out who we are, what we really want. Maybe then, if it's meant to be, we can find our way back to each other. It wasn't the answer I had hoped for, but it was the one I needed to hear. We both needed time to heal, to find ourselves again before we could even think about being together. Okay, I agreed, though the words felt like they were tearing me apart. Time apart, to figure things out. We sat in silence for a while longer, the weight of our decision settling over us like a heavy blanket. When Daniel finally stood to leave, he reached out and squeezed my hand, a gesture that was both comforting and heartbreaking. Take care of yourself, he said softly, echoing the words my husband had said to me not so long ago. You too, I replied, my voice trembling. And then, just like that, he was gone, leaving me alone in the park, the echoes of our conversation ringing in my ears. Marriage. Flipping through the pages, I was struck by how hopeful and full of life I had been back then, how much I had believed in the future. Reading those entries brought a lump to my throat, but it also reminded me of something important, who I had been before everything went wrong. I realized that I had lost sight of that person, that I had allowed the pressures of life to drown out the things that had once brought me joy. Determined to reclaim that part of myself, I started making small changes. I began going to therapy, something I had put off for too long. I reconnected with old friends, people I had distanced myself from during the turmoil of the past few years. I even picked up some old hobbies that I had abandoned, painting, writing, things that allowed me to express myself in ways I had forgotten. Slowly but surely, I started to feel like myself again. The guilt and shame didn't disappear overnight, but I learned how to manage them, how to move forward without being weighed down by the past. And then, one day, I received an unexpected message from my husband. He was in town and wanted to meet up for coffee. My heart skipped a beat at the thought of seeing him again, but I agreed, curious about what he wanted to say. When we met at the same coffee shop where we had said our goodbyes, I was surprised by how different he looked. There was a lightness about him, a sense of peace that I hadn't seen in a long time. We talked for a while, catching up on the little things, work, life, the usual pleasantries. But I could tell there was something more he wanted to say, something important. Finally, he took a deep breath and looked at me, his expression serious. I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I wanted you to know that I've forgiven you. His words took me by surprise, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. Forgiven me? I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded. It wasn't easy, but I realized that holding on to the anger and the hurt wasn't doing me any good. I needed to let go, for both our sakes. Tears welled up in my eyes, and I blinked them back, overwhelmed by the kindness in his words. Thank you, I said, my voice trembling. That means more to me than you know, he smiled faintly, a bittersweet expression. We both made mistakes, But that doesn't mean we're bad people. It just means we're human. I've forgiven myself too, and I hope you can do the same." His words were a gift, a final piece of closure that I hadn't realized I needed. For so long, I had been carrying the weight of my guilt, punishing myself for what I had done. But now, hearing him say that he had forgiven me, I felt a sense of relief that I hadn't felt in years. "I'll try," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I really will." We talked for a while longer, about nothing in particular, just enjoying each other's company in a way that we hadn't been able to for a long time. And when we finally said our goodbyes, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known in a long time. As I walked away from the coffee shop, I realized that this was the start of a new chapter in my life, a chapter that would be written on my own terms. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I was okay with that. I was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that I had the strength to overcome it. My story isn't over yet, but for now, this is where it ends. I'm still learning, still growing, and still figuring out who I am. But I know one thing for sure: I'm stronger than I ever thought I could be, and I'm ready for whatever the future holds.